Matthew of NYU Stern School. My name is Steve Ratner. I am the faculty director of the Donia Human Rights Center. For those of you who are not familiar with the center, it's the university's focal point for the study and practice of human rights. We have, in addition to our monthly speaker series, we are also have an undergraduate fellows program for PIC students. We have research for faculty. We have a number of summer internships for both undergraduates and graduate students. And this year we have welcomed our first practitioner in residence, Hala Al-Karib from Sudan, who is spending the semester here on a sort of sabbatical from her important NGO work in East Africa. I am going to introduce the moderator and commentator for today's panel, today's discussion, and then he will introduce our speakers. So I'm happy to pass the baton for today over to Professor Ravi Anupindi. Ravi is the Colonel William G. and Ann Svetlich Professor of Operations Research and Management at the Ross School. And he's also, quite importantly for the University of Michigan, the longtime chair of the President's Advisory Committee on Labor Standards and Human Rights, which is responsible for setting the university's policies on everything from apparel to food sourcing and all the other intersections between the university and human rights. He's also affiliated with many other centers around the university, including the Donia Human Rights Center. And his research is about technology, business innovation, global supply chain management, including human rights issues, and healthcare, and social sustainability, and all the ESG related issues. So he's the perfect person to be our moderator and commentator today, and I'm happy to pass the floor over to Professor Anupindi.
Good afternoon. How are you? Sober after yesterday's. It's important, right? Okay. Well, thank you, Steve, and it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Mike Posner. He is the Jerome Kohlberg Professor of Ethics and Finance at NYU's Stern School of Business. He's a founding director, right? You founded the Center for Business and Human Rights. It's the first human rights center in a business school. Why don't we have one? Okay. He previously served in the Obama administration as Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and led the New York-based advocacy organization Human Rights First for several years. But I mean, that's the brief bio. First of all, Mike is a Michigan alum. Go Blue, right? Die-hard fan. He told me that yesterday he ended his class an hour early to go watch the game. So that's how dedicated a fan he is. My interaction with Mike was, so as Steve in his introduction said that I chaired the advisory committee here to the president. It's a mouthful, President's Advisory Committee on Labor Standards and Human Rights. Yes, it does focus on apparel, that is there, but the rest is aspirational. We're trying to get there on food and other stuff, right? So, but for university to uphold labor standards and human rights in licensing, we are also members of a multi-stakeholder initiative called the Fair Labor Association. So it was through that I came to know Mike. He served as the chair of the board of the FLA for several years. He just recently stepped down. And I've seen him kind of very close working through the FLA about the opportunity, the promise, and the challenges of getting different sectors together, which is business, civil society, unions, universities together to do the right thing from labor standards, human rights, and global supply chain. So that's the lens through which I have interacted with Mike on these, and we've exchanged lots of ideas, etc. So I was really delighted that he accepted to come. Of course, he doesn't need an excuse to come to Michigan. Anything that he needs, he'll come to Michigan. That much I knew. So it was an easy hook in some ways, but I then, we are keeping him for 2 days. But here's the book. Unfortunately, this is on our end. We didn't plan enough in advance, even though we knew this was coming, to have a stack of books here for him to autograph, but didn't make it happen. But I highly recommend. I just finished reading it, the last chapter, while watching basketball last night, because I wanted to finish it before I saw Mike. It gets into a lot of detail. He's played, I mean, his bio doesn't, here in the printed one, doesn't do justice to his impact in the space of getting, really believing that businesses have a very strong role. And as you will see, hopefully in the book also, he talks about not only the labor standards in terms of standard apparel and that kind of stuff, but as we move into social media and AI and other areas, there's a lot of human rights issues that are there embedded in those issues, so on those contexts as well. And he talks about a lot of that stuff. But I think what I was having lunch with him, I knew him through the FLA, but I didn't know how foundational a role he played in the formation of the FLA itself in 1999. So anyway, this talk is his, not mine. So without further ado, let's welcome Mike Posner to the table.
Thanks. Thank you. So thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Steve. Delighted to be here, and especially today. I did, in fact, tell my students last night when I left at 8 o'clock that as much as I love you, I love Michigan basketball just a little bit more. So I was very pleased. So I'm going to just say a few words by way of introduction, and I hope we can have a real discussion here. It's more fun for me, and I'm sure for you. As Ravi said, I've worked in the human rights field for a long time, and both with an organization called Human Rights First. I was there many years. And in that context, I sort of bumped up against the notion of business without really myself being a business person or knowing the relationship of business and human rights. The assumption always was that human rights is really the domain of governments. Governments need to be held accountable. And I believe that that's true. But I also believe that in the world in which we live today, a lot of governments are not doing their job. So if you look at the 193 governments in the world and you look at how many people are living in places where governments are either unwilling or unable to protect their own people, it's the vast majority of the 8 billion people on our planet. So when I went into government, one of the things that really struck me, I worked for Hillary Clinton, I worked in the Obama administration, running the bureau called Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. One of the things that really struck me was the kind of antiquated or quaint nature of our government and every government. We'd spend a lot of time going to meetings with other governments. We'd all have our flag behind us and our little placard in front saying what country we're from. We'd sit around these tables pretending that we were solving the world's problems. And I thought to myself, there's sort of three big things we talked about. We talked about violent extremism, terrorism. And sure enough, ISIS and Al-Qaeda have flags, but they weren't at our table. In fact, they had no interest in being at our table. In fact, they wanted to blow up our table of governments. And yet we spent hundreds of billions, maybe trillions of dollars dealing with this group that we actually didn't engage with. Understood why. We have humanitarian crises. We have development crises. There's a hurricane in New Orleans. There's an Ebola crisis in Africa. There's COVID. And no government has the wherewithal to deal with those problems by themselves. And so you have the International Committee of the Red Cross, or you have the Catholic Relief Service. You have a range of non-governmental organizations supplementing what government does. And then finally, on the economic sphere, which is what this book is about and what I've worked on for now a number of years, if you compare, economists hate when I do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. If you compare gross domestic product of countries and revenues of companies, half of the biggest economies of the world are not states, they're private companies. Walmart's revenues now, or Amazon's, $700 billion. Amazon revenues are more or less equal to the gross domestic product of Belgium or Taiwan. And so I would say, I said to Secretary Clinton, why do we have an ambassador to Benin and we don't have an ambassador to Walmart? Is there any doubt that the biggest American companies are having more of an impact on our world? And that sort of, it just kept hitting me when I was in the government. Why are we not dealing with the biggest commercial enterprises that are based in the United States that have a global reach and that are affecting people's lives in very profound ways? And we haven't really figured out how to deal with what they're doing. Government has two speeds when it comes to private companies. One is to promote exports. I was all in favor of that. Balance of payments, balance of trade. We want American companies to compete and succeed in the world. I was behind that. Or public-private partnerships. So we have a technology need, and we go to Microsoft or one of the big tech companies, and they provide the technology to keep track of displaced people somewhere in the world. All of that's fine, but the third speed or the third gear, how the companies themselves are behaving seemed not really a priority. So when I was in the government, I kept raising my hand. Somebody would say, we need somebody to be the head of the voluntary principles on security and human rights. 29 oil and mining companies, 8 governments, 20 NGOs. And my hand was the only hand that went up. And when we were talking about the blood diamonds and the Kimberley process, my hand was the only one that was going up. When we talked about conflict minerals, my hand was the only one going up. And so I thought to myself, boy, this is a gap. It's a gap of thinking, and it reflects the fact that we haven't really made this a serious field. And so when I got out of government, when I was getting out of government, I thought to myself, I came with a colleague from the State Department, and we said, this belongs in business schools. Business leaders for the 21st century need to be thinking about these things. At the end of the day, it's some combination of government regulating and business internalizing these issues. The issues are real. The issues are consequential. Governments are not doing their job. There's a governance gap. And we need to figure out whether it's in labor supply chains, whether it's with tech, whether we're dealing with the investment sector. We've got to figure out ways to really recalibrate what's going on here. So a couple of premises in which we start. We say we're pro-business, but we want high standards. Businesses love when we say we're pro-business, they're not so crazy about the standards part. And so part of what we're trying to do, and a couple of other premises. We live in a world where globalization is a reality. I don't think that's entirely a bad thing. In fact, some aspects of it are really quite good. I tell my students, in 1980, 77% of everybody living in East Asia was living below the extreme poverty level of $1.25 a day. 65% in South Asia. If you just look at East Asia today, that's primarily a China issue. Today, extreme poverty in China is less than 3%. It's the most extraordinary human rights development of the last 50 years. Almost 2 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. That's not development programs. It's not the World Bank primarily. It's not UNDP. It's jobs. It's the private sector. Globalization has moved people from rural to urban, from farming to manufacturing or service. That is a broad evolution, and it's made a huge difference both in East Asia and South Asia. Less so in Africa, we could talk about that, a bit in Latin America, but there is a huge human rights benefit for people being able to work, get a paycheck, help their families, and change. That's the good news about globalization. The bad news is we don't have rules of the road. We don't have recognition that in these weak states, when Walmart or Amazon or any of these gigantic companies show up in these states where there's a governance gap, there are no rules that really constrain their behavior. And so in the 1990s, companies would say, we follow local law. That is a completely inadequate response. If local law is not sufficient, it doesn't meet the standards of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the ILO 190 Conventions on Labor. So part of what we're trying to do, I came to NYU 13 years ago, set up a center. We're trying to put some meat on the bones. And we're doing it in 3 ways. I'm going to just describe those briefly, and then I'm going to stop talking, and hopefully we'll have a conversation, Ravi, with you and then the rest of you. We've identified 3 broad categories. The first is everything to do with outsourcing of labor, outsourcing, what I call the outsourcing of responsibility. So whether it's manufacturing for apparel or electronics or toys or automobiles, there is a move from production in the industrial states, the US, Europe, et cetera, to places where labor is cheaper. That's a phenomenon, again, of the last 40 or 50 years. There is an outsourcing in a different way of the gathering of raw materials, mining, oil, cobalt and lithium for batteries that fuel the cars and electronics. There's a separate set of issues relating to fishing, to farming. There's a range of ways in which big global companies have gone somewhere else to these places where there's a governance gap, and they are the beneficiaries of being able to produce things faster, cheaper. It's good for them in terms of the bottom line, but there's inadequate attention to what's the consequence for the people who are actually producing their products, whether it's a pair of blue jeans, or it's food, or it's fish, or it's gold or cobalt. Second category is tech. We started, and I'll tell you the story from my experience. I worked on 3 speeches for Hillary Clinton during the Arab Spring, the Arab Awakening, 2010-11, on internet freedom. We came at this with an enthusiasm as the social media sites were basically being developed. If you may remember, the Egyptian uprising in Tahrir Square was called the Facebook Revolution. I spent a lot of time when I was in government in Egypt. I was there 8 times, including 6 weeks before Tahrir Square. And one of the things that struck me was that there was a lot of unhappiness, but people didn't know how to organize because the police, the security forces would crack down on anybody organizing with their friends in their home or certainly on the street. There's no question that social media allowed people to collect information about what's going on, and they came together in Tahrir Square, aided by social media. There is no doubt that that was a factor. And so it was sort of with that in mind that we said in 3 speeches that I helped to write, the internet, social media is creating the town square of the 21st century. I still believe that. What I don't believe is that it's only a positive initiative. And so by 2014, to give you a flavor of how my thinking evolved, I thought, we're going to work with Facebook. We're going to work with Google. We're going to try to figure out how to deal with the harmful consequences of what's going on. 2014, I did a lot of work in Burma, in Myanmar. My Burmese friends started calling and saying, the government, the military, is weaponizing social media. 93% in Burma and Myanmar get onto social media via Facebook. They called the internet Facebook. And the military had weaponized the system to target the Rohingya, the Muslim population in Rakhine State, more than 1 million people. They were accusing them of, of basically trying to overthrow the government, and they were saying these are Bengalis, they shouldn't be here. They stirred an uprising that resulted in more than 1 million people being expelled from the country in a violent way. I called my friend at Facebook, as I had gotten 20 calls or emails. And I said, what's going on here? What are you guys doing about what's happening in Burma? He said, what's going on in Burma? This is the guy who's in charge of public policy at Facebook, which is making $100 billion a year in ads. I said, why don't you go check? And he comes back after 2 days and he says, I've talked to everybody in Menlo Park, and nobody knows what you're talking about. How do you know about this? And I said, the real question is, how do you not know about it? And he said, well, actually, there's nobody here at headquarters who speaks Burmese. 50 million people, a country that's about to endure what the UN eventually called a genocide, and 93% of the people in that country are getting online via Facebook, and nobody at home at Facebook, $120 billion revenues, nobody speaks Burmese. That, for me, was a wake-up call. I thought to myself, these companies are engaged in a business model relating to engagement. Everything is about getting people on the site to stay on the site. They know, we all know, MIT, the Media Lab's done studies now for almost 20 years that says people go online, stay online, all of us, because there's an emotional connection. Negative emotions trump positive emotions. Every year, top of the list, hate and fear. You want to understand our politics in the United States? Understand that the algorithms are pushing us towards the emotional high that I guess we get when we find out that others share our anxieties and our fears and our hatred. And so we began working on this, and there was a big discussion, which I'm happy to have, about the role of government in regulating technology, now amplified, now on steroids with AI. I have no doubt that now I've come to the sad conclusion the companies are never going to do what needs to be done until they are forced to do the right thing. I don't want to regulate content, but I want to regulate the algorithms, the design. I want to regulate the way they operate. Second area. Third area is investment. Investors drive the train. At the end of the day, especially in the public markets, if you're running a Fortune 500 company, you have investors relentlessly trying to tell you you've got to save money. You've got to make sure that you maximize financial returns in the short term, And that makes people running big companies, it ties their hands. Even those that are most committed to doing the right thing, at the end of the day, the quarterly calls with investors are not about human rights. They're not about climate change. They're not about diversity. They're about maximizing returns. And so one of the things we've done is to begin to dig into how do we begin to change that, that way of thinking. I work 2 miles from Wall Street. I'm right in the middle of seeing what this looks like. It's different in Europe. There's no doubt there is a greater sensibility about the need to integrate what economists call externalities, things like environment and human rights. It is sorely lacking in the United States, and with a current administration in Washington, we've actually moved backwards. But our notion is we need to find an alternative model for investors And we're trying to push a notion that there ought to be a way in which some of us who care enough about human rights, labor rights, environment, have alternatives. Right now, it's there's $30 trillion in what are called ESG funds, environmental social governance. They're all about looking at risk to investors, not people or the planet. They're a giant marketing scheme. There's no serious evaluation of companies that are doing better. So even for us as consumers, as investors, there's no way of really, in a serious way, evaluating company performance. Who's doing the best on environment? Who's doing the best on labor rights and human rights? Last comment, I'm going to stop. This is a field early in its days. I've been working in human rights a long time. This feels to me about where we were in the 70s, dare I say, and early 80s in the human rights field. 1,000 flowers bloom. There's a lot of missteps. There's a lot of nonsense. There's a lot of pretend. We need to be more deliberate in figuring out how do we create real accountability for companies? How do we push the companies internally to begin to think about these issues as business priorities? I try to be practical about this. I want to know not how are companies giving away money, how are they making money? What's their core business model? What are the human rights problems that evolve from that? Again, there's nothing illegitimate about working in something and having a problem. The question is, what do we do about it? We've got to have clear standards. We've got to have clear metrics. Companies need to be evaluated in a serious way, and we need accountability. And it's some combination of what governments, the best governments, are willing to do to hold companies accountable, and how internally we get companies to begin to think about these things as priorities. When companies tell me, and they do all the time, these issues are really hard, we're on a journey. I always say to them, are you on a journey to make a profit? Are you on a journey to have quality control? Are you on a journey to worry about worker retention? No, those are priorities. You have metrics. People get promoted or lose their job depending on what the metrics show you. The moment at which we have metrics about human rights in business, we're going to have a very different discussion. We're not there today, but that's where we're trying to head. Let me stop with that, and delighted to take, well, let's first, Ravi, I'd love you to come and start badgering me with questions. Should we sit? Should we stand? What do you want to do? I'm doing whatever you. We're going to sit.
Yeah. This is like our digital studio at Ross, glare, whole thing. But thank you, Mike. I mean, that was very powerful, of course, very short. I wish you had elaborated on many of those, but I want to pick up on the last point, which is we need to be more deliberate about creating real accountability. Could you talk about, based on your experience, what are some of the mechanisms that can be done? I mean, you talk a lot about the FLA in the book, either FLA or other mechanisms by which this can come about. Are there any quote-unquote success stories, and how does that come about?
Yeah. So let me just say, as before I got involved in the Fair Labor Association, which was in 1996 during the Clinton administration, I had like occasional. I bumped up against labor issues in consumer goods in a couple of different ways, and it made me clear it all made me realize that we really had a long way to go. My first encounter was with a guy named Ben Cohn. He's Ben of Ben and Jerry's. So Ben Cohn is being courted by Unilever, who wants to buy his ice cream company. They did eventually buy the ice cream company, but this was an early effort to kind of get Ben and Jerry to sell their company. And I get a call from him, somebody put him in touch with me, and he says, I need your help. And I said, well, what's going on? And he said, I'm negotiating with Unilever, and I've just told them we're not going to sell our company unless they improve their human rights performance by 25%. And I said, what did you mean by that? He said, I have no idea. That's why I called you. So that's where we were. That's where we were. Levi Strauss was the subject of a media expose on 60 Minutes. They were making blue jeans in Saipan, and with the label Made in USA, because Saipan was part of Micronesia, which was still a trust territory of the United States. The workers were young Chinese girls, young, very young, who were being brought from China to work in Saipan. 60 Minutes sneaks a camera into the factory, and the next minute they're in San Francisco banging on the door of Bob Haas. It was at that point a privately held company. And so I get a call from the public affairs guy at Levi Strauss, and he said, you know, Bob Haas, who's a pillar of the San Francisco elite establishment, it's the Haas School of Business at Berkeley, there's Haas Theater, Haas everything. He wants to do something. And so we sort of cooked up the idea that maybe they ought to be talking to their suppliers about human rights. It was a radical idea. This is the early 1990s, not so long ago, really. And so they developed the first code of conduct for their suppliers. And so they put them on the wall of all the factories. And so I thought to myself, between Ben Cohn, who's trying to figure out what 25% of improvement is, and Levi Strauss, which is putting up a sheet of paper on their suppliers' walls, which are changing every month, we really are nowhere near where we need to be. 2 incidents in the 90s, it's a long-winded answer, but it gives you a little flavor.
Plenty of time.
2 incidents in the 1990s led to the creation of student activism about sweatshops, the United Students Against Sweatshop. Michigan was one of the prime movers in that, students here. One was a TV personality named Kathy Lee Gifford was producing her signature brand in Honduras for Walmart. And somebody, again, expose, conditions are terrible. Kathy Lee Gifford is raked over the coals publicly for the way in which her product is being produced. More dramatic still in Los Angeles, in a little part of East Los Angeles called El Monte, 26 Thai women were basically locked in a factory. And US officials came in to kind of free them. Again, massive public attention. Robert Reich, the labor secretary, went to President Clinton and he said, there's a sweatshop problem, we have to do something about it. So they convened a Rose Garden ceremony in August of 1996. That's how I got involved in the Fair Labor Association. It didn't exist yet as an organization, but they brought together Nike and Reebok, a bunch of companies, some unions and NGOs, and they said, we've got a problem, you've got a problem, sweatshops, go do something about it. So the next month, Robert Reich convenes a meeting in the old executive office building. I'll never forget this. And he walks in and he says, the fact that we're having a second meeting means that this has exceeded our wildest expectations. I thought, we are really in trouble here. We've been basically handed this big knotty problem, and the US government has just told us they're excited we're having a second meeting. Well, somehow we managed to get to 6 months. we developed a set of 9 labor standards: forced labor, child labor, hours of work, discrimination, harassment. 9 standards based on the ILO, International Labor Organization. And we went back to the White House, another meeting with the president, and he said, great, you've got the standards, now go create an organization. Turned out the standards were the easy part. We spent 3 years fighting like cats and dogs about what it would mean to create an organization. And we created it with a couple of things in mind. One is that companies, we were not going to name and shame companies. This was not a gotcha exercise, but we were going to hold the companies to a serious standard. Those 9 standards evolved into probably 150 metrics. So we started to define, what are we really talking about here? Second thing is that we said, we're not going to take the company's word for this. We're going to actually create a series of people who work for this organization called the Fair Labor Association. It's now about 45 employees, budget of $12 million. It's a real organization. And we're going to authorize or accredit monitors in different countries to actually go out and see what's going on. Not a lot, but a certain number of factories for each company. We're going to go, for these brands, we're going to go see what are they doing. So there's standards, metrics, assessment, and accountability. A few times, companies have been put on probation, in effect. New Era Cab, Gildan, big apparel company from Canada. Few companies have been pushed out. Syngenta, Seed, and Esquel from Hong Kong, because they had big operations in Xinjiang, in China. But more importantly, and this finally, Ravi, goes to your question, there are a bunch of stories where companies have come in, and the one I most appreciate is a company called Fast Retailing. Fast fashion, it's Uniqlo to you. The guy who owns the company, who started the company, richest man in Japan, richest person, came in and he basically said, we are an Asian company operating in Asia. We know we haven't really thought these things through. We're going to come in and you're going to find a mess. But we want you to put us through the paces. And I remember a board meeting we had where they came in, and we have all these metrics, all these charts and things. And they came in at about 50% on most of the things that we looked at. And we celebrated their 50% because they came from 10% or 15%. And after 5 years, they got to 50. That, to me, is the sign of success for an organization where you're actually pushing companies seriously to improve their performance.
Building up on that, I think with the conversation we were having over lunch, one of the structures of the FLA, which some of you may be familiar with, is it's not just the 3 different streams that come together, which is the business, the civil society, and universities. What do you see as the role universities can play in this? And how does it, in which areas would it work and not work? Or without the universities, can this actually work, this kind of structure?
Well, I mean, Ravi, what you've done here at Michigan with the commission that you've worked on for years is really a model of what lots of universities should do. Universities are thought leaders, but they're also big businesses. And at the end of the day, what's sold and what's produced by the cafeteria, by the food that you're buying and dispensing is part of what any business does. Universities are thought leaders. They're also ethical. They ought to be, and often are kind of ethical bellwethers for our society. And there's expertise, supply chain, which you teach, Ravi. I think most supply chain professors at business schools don't spend enough time thinking about the effect of the supply chain on the worker. I think there's room for universities to drive the discussion. I should say, and Robbie, you and I were just talking about this, the FLA wouldn't have existed. It wouldn't have succeeded in getting started and getting its feet on the ground if it weren't for the universities, because they came in as a third partner with companies, NGOs, and unions. And for a company like Nike or Adidas or Under Armour, university business was a big enough deal that they didn't want to walk away. If you had 120 universities saying, you better be part of the FLA or we're not going to do business, that was enough of an incentive to actually get them to come to the table and stay at the table. Warren Buffett's sidekick, Charlie Munger, says, if you show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome. The incentive for Nike and Adidas was university business. So that's what got him there. But now I think we have to be creative and figure out how do we use the intellectual firepower of universities, the ethical frame that they bring to the debate, and the experience and the expertise. That's really the key.
Yeah, thanks. By the way, I just want to recognize here Professor Siobhan Harlow. She is my mentor as I took over from her chairing this committee, but she was the founding chair. I think you served for almost... Brian Talbot was. Okay, but you served for almost a decade or so, but thank you, yeah. So expanding on that, if you talked about AI or in general technology, I mean, one is physical supply chains, so physical supply chains, whether it is food, apparel, footwear, whatever, so I mean, but then you have technology, right? And you mentioned about this, whether it is creating the town square of the 20th century and, the Facebook story, et cetera. But then you ended with saying there is a critical role of the government in regulating tech. So is it that you're concluding that there is really in the tech space, they have to be forced to do the right thing? There is no other way?
There's no other way.
Okay.
And it's hard. It's hard because different technology is a lot more complicated than producing blue jeans. There are multiple technologies. It's evolving very quickly. The tech companies are, I would say, singularly hostile to any notion of being regulated. There was a while where Meta was having these monthly ads in Axios where they would say, we want to be regulated. Every time I saw those ads, I would call somebody at Meta and say, which regulation are you in favor of this month? The answer is none. They don't want to be regulated, period. They think they're the smartest people on earth. And they are smart, there's no doubt about it. But they also are living on this engagement model that is driven by advertising that's causing a lot of harm. And so we have to take a deep breath and say, we want to preserve the right to speech. I don't want Meta and Mark Zuckerberg determining what comes up and what comes down. I don't want the government telling them what comes up, what comes down. But their model is not working for our society. It's working for them. And again, I'm not somebody who believes let's go back to the Stone Age and pretend that there's no generative AI. It's here to stay. It's going to keep expanding. We need to get it under control. And I think the way you do it, there's a couple of things in particular. The design of the algorithms. It's like the secret sauce for Coca-Cola. They don't want anybody to know how are they designing these ways in which we're experiencing social media and now AI. At the end of the day, the algorithms are doing some things that are not in society's best interest. So we need to, one, have better transparency, and we need to be thinking about what can we do to adjust the design. I'll give you one example. There are now companies, there are people making money. I'm pro-business. Here's a business I'm in favor of. It's the business of what's called middleware. Their companies have created technology that would allow us to design our own algorithm. So there's the algorithm that Meta gives us. You could say, no, I don't like that one. I want chronological feed, or I want something else. Middleware technology would let us establish greater agency and ownership of the way in which our machines work. The companies, to say the least, do not want that industry to succeed. And so every time a state suggests that, or anybody puts it forward, they spend an enormous amount of money going to court, going to state legislatures, saying, we do not want middleware. It's that kind of thing. It's not that complicated. We can make it better, and at the end of the day, they're going to be pushed. They're not going to do it without some government oversight.
I'll just make one more comment in the context of technology. While we're talking about here, the algorithms, et cetera, which is more about the space of attention of the users, there is an equivalent of a physical or human rights supply chain also there in terms of content moderation and how that is being checked, all that stuff. Enough stories, I'm sure we have read about this stuff in terms of how these companies are actually, this is no different than the sweatshop industry and apparel,
Right.
but how this is being structured. And just last week there was some opinion piece in the New York Times. But I would urge you, if you've not read the book called The Empire of AI, I don't know if you've come across this.
Yeah.
It's the story of OpenAI and how it came to be. But there's a whole chapter there about how labor exploitation happens in content moderation. So when you open the floodgates of anything that can go in the content, and then you say, well, no, this is like doing quality check ex post. I've put garbage out there, then I'll have people to check if it is garbage or not. But that is just it just reminds me of all the sweatshop that happens in physical supply chains too. So that's just a comment. I mean, that we can still hold the companies responsible for. This is not algorithm issue in some ways, or maybe it's connected.
Totally.
But yeah, it's what content comes in and how that content gets distributed. I'm a supply chain person, so I think of production distribution.
Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
so yeah.
Content moderation is a core function of what these companies, let's focus on social media. If they didn't moderate content, spam, child pornography, there are a bunch of things. If they let it all hang out there, the advertisers wouldn't pay for it. And so they do moderate content when it's in their interest. But it's expensive, it takes a lot of energy, and so what they've done is to outsource it. This is another example of outsourcing responsibility. Meta goes to Accenture, which is a consulting firm, which hires young kids in the Philippines or India at $3 an hour to sit in front of a screen for 16 hours. They get PTSD after 6 months, and then they hire another bunch of them. I went to people at Meta and I said, why don't you just hire people who get a Meta paycheck that you train, that you do, psychological counseling. And I went to Nick Clegg, who was, at that point, they had a public policy, a former British politician. And he said to me, oh, that would be really expensive. I said, yeah, it might cost you $1 billion, but again, you're making many, many times that. He said, do you really mean in every country? I said, behave like a grown-up. You've got operations in 180 countries. He said, do you really mean every country? I said, okay, you don't have to do it in Finland. I think they've got it under control. He said, well, we were thinking of having 50 people in Menlo Park oversee this. The rest we're going to outsource. They're ridiculous. The companies have to behave like grown-ups.
Well, thank you. So I want to open the floor for questions from the audience. So let me know, and we'll pass on the mic. We have sufficient time for some good discussion. Yeah. Maybe as you get the mic, please introduce yourself, who you are. Name, not only name, but which school, or what are you studying if you're a student, if you're a faculty, which school you are in, etc. There are mics there. Oh, you could just go there and maybe just we'll have to force you to stand up and ask questions. Sorry, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I'm Alex. I'm from Students for International Labor Solidarity. We're formerly Students Against Sweatshops, and I just wanted to talk to you about one of our campaigns that we're working on right now. I think you'd have some worthwhile insight into one of the bigger problems that we're currently dealing with. Last summer on our delegation, we met with workers from Honduras, where we were staying, and these were textile workers who were, for the most part, upstream in the apparel supply chain. And they ultimately didn't know who they were actually making clothes for because of the subcontracting model, which I know you're familiar with. Anyway, as you also may know, our school, which has a $174 million contract with Nike, by the way, and is a major player in the global garment industry, we also work with the Collegiate Licensing Company, and they have a code of conduct which we are supposed to be enforcing, which requires that that all factories in the supply chain are disclosed to a third party, like the Workers' Rights Consortium, for example. But that's currently not the case. Our licensees don't do that. So I just wanted to get your opinion on how you think the best way to move forward. Do you think that the university should be enforcing this code of conduct and asking its licensees to do the right thing? Thank you.
Yes, I think the university ought to be enforcing. But let me just back up, and you said something in passing that I want to focus on. One of the challenges here, again, the outsourcing of responsibility. There is a worldwide phenomenon of global buyers entering into contracts with local partners, let's say in Honduras, that they know can't be fulfilled. A buyer once said to me, we go into these things with one eye open and one eye closed. And so they contract for 100,000 t-shirts in Honduras with a factory they know can only produce 40,000 in the time that's designated. So they go down the street to their cousin or to somebody they know, and they take pieces of that and they subcontract it. That's what you said, and it happens all the time. Subcontracting is not a four-letter word. There ought to be, and what companies say is it's unauthorized, but they know it's happening. And so part of what we need to do, and you ought to do as student activists as you're working on this, is be focused on how do we actually create a supply chain where there's greater transparency and visibility, and where companies like Nike are taking responsibility for where their stuff is actually being produced. We did a study in Bangladesh after the Rana Plaza collapse. The big brand said, we have 2,500 factories. There's another 1,500 we know of exporting. That's 4,000. We spent 2 years going through with 5 databases and students on the ground. We found 7,000 factories producing garments. Those factories, including the ones at Rana Plaza, were subcontracting factories. So this is not just a Nike problem or a U of M problem. Across the board, we need greater transparency. I want, rather than saying they're unauthorized, I want Nike and other big global brands to say, we demand knowing where's the stuff actually being produced. We're not going to penalize you for that, but we actually want to see the conditions in the factories where stuff is being produced. If that happened, the workers you met with would have a better chance of being brought into the system that Michigan and other schools are pushing Nike to be part of.
Yeah, thank you so much. If I may just ask a quick follow-up.
Sure.
So in the event that Nike doesn't want to do that, is it incumbent on the university as its license, like because Nike is its licensee, is it then incumbent on the university to require Nike, to force Nike, to ask them to do that?
It's incumbent on the university, and I know this because, Ravi and I have worked on this together. It's incumbent on the university to be forthright with Nike and to raise concerns about exactly the kind of thing you're talking about. It's good, I have a long history with Nike, and it's quite mixed. I think it's better that they're part of the Fair Labor Association. I think it's great that a university like Michigan, which has a big contract, as you say, is in their face and saying, there are things you're doing we don't approve of. The alternative is to stand outside and scream at them. They're a tough company. They're not warm and fuzzy. But I want Michigan and other schools to be constantly pushing them to behave better than they're inclined to behave on their own.
All right, great. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Idra. I'm a senior at the School of Public Policy. We actually met briefly when I was a Donia Human Rights Center fellow in Belfast last summer, so great to see you again. This is kind of a loaded question, and you can take it any way that you want, but how can we incentivize corporations to stay in areas with workers' rights rather than just moving on to the next destination?
Yeah, it's a good question. Let me go back to Bangladesh for a second because it's a good example. The day that the Rana Plaza collapsed and 1,100 workers were killed, mostly young women, Disney announced that they were leaving Bangladesh. And I wrote a piece for the New York Times saying, shame on you. You do not cut and run. You stay. You don't just run away from the problem because you're going someplace else where there's going to be a problem. I want big companies to be in tough places. I know how hard it is, and there's a reputational risk. But the alternative of running away from it is not going to actually improve the lives of workers. This happens all the time. And I think in general, we have all these discussions about China. There's all kinds of problems in the world. Again, governance gap. Most people in the world live someplace where their own government's part of the problem. If a big company goes there, it ought to go with its eyes open, but at the same time be ready to be there for the long haul and figure out what can it do individually and collectively to try to improve the well-being of workers. Workers are not benefited by all the companies running away.
Thank you.
Other questions? Oh, yeah.
As you said, Siobhan Harlow, Professor Emerita of Public Health. I just wanted to add the role of the university, because I think a critical component is the students.
Mhm.
And so I think the students, both here and across the country, have been a critical voice in keeping the issue present. I think, there are certainly the expertise in faculty who are working on this, but I think the students and the continuation, I understand United Sweatshops is now this organization, but that voice of the students that both keeps it present both in the university but in the broader consumer and public societal sphere, as well as the important pressure they put, right? That in any argument, you need to have people at one level. The president will be resisting action, and the committee tries to argue for an action, but you need the pressure point. And so I just think that recognizing that role of students, and particularly for those of you here, I know the history of the students has been really critical. I also wanted to ask, I know when the field of public health began to think in terms of a human rights framework for the work that we do, I just wonder what your thoughts are, because in public health, we really have tried to build sort of a whole framework how the work we do is done through a lens of human rights. And to some extent, the code of conduct and the metrics are a piece of getting to that point, but to what extent, and perhaps your book is aiming for this, is there sort of creation of a model and lens through which all of the work that is done goes through a framework of human rights in the, in the private sphere?
Yeah. Let me, a quick comment on your first comment, then I'll answer your question. One of the things I write about in the book is Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola in the 90s had a factory, a bottling plant. They didn't own or operate in Colombia in South America, where 2 union leaders were shot on the floor of the bottling plant. Coke took the view, that's not our problem. We don't own the factory. They were sued. And students led an effort called Killer Coke, which resulted in Coca-Cola products being banned on 100 university campuses. Michigan was part of that. That had a huge impact on the company. It forced them to change. So I totally agree with you. Companies, especially consumer-facing companies, are thinking about their consumers, and people on university campuses are not only consumers today, they're going to be consumers for a long time. And so the more students are raising these issues, it makes what I'm trying to do, and what Robbie's trying to do, a heck of a lot easier. So I totally agree with you. Framework, yes. Again, human rights for governments are all the same. That is to say, every government has a court system. Every government has a prison system. Every government has a set of laws on human rights. And we've created this thing called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which sets a floor. But we're dealing with Brazil and Haiti and Rwanda and Indonesia, all using the same standard. It's more complicated for companies. Meta, Exxon, Walmart are 3 different kinds of companies in different industries. So I think use the same human rights framework, but then set standards for each industry. I think that's where we need to go. And again, the Fair Labor Association did it for apparel and now agriculture. I think every industry we need to think about, what does it mean for tech? What does it mean for mining? What does it mean for construction? What does it mean for the pharmaceutical industry? But the human rights standards are real. We just need to elaborate on what does it mean in a particular industry to take those broad words, right to health, or whatever it is, and give it meaning. It can't just be aspirational. It needs to be based on real experience by experts coming to say, here's what we need to do in this industry, and you need to bring industry leaders together to be part of that conversation, not to determine it, but to have a voice in trying to figure out what those standards are. We just wrote a report, gave it to Ravi, about private equity in healthcare in the United States. There needs to be some rules about that. Not working at all. We need to figure out what are the standards for health, what are the standards for health, and what does it mean when private equity takes a nursing home or a hospital and does whatever they do, and there's no regulation of that. We need to be paying attention to that.
I have some thoughts on that, but I want to still keep, so I wanted to cold call on Steve to ask a question.
So thanks, Mike. So I've been teaching a seminar on business and human rights for a long time at the law school. And one of the things I'd really be curious to hear your views about is that BHR conversations, ever since the UN Guiding Principles and all the examples that you've given, are all about multinationals.
Right.
Dominated by conversations about multinationals, and because those are the companies that have the nationality that we're familiar with, US, German, Canadian, whatever. But the vast majority of negative impacts of on human rights by business happen by companies that are not even part of the global supply chain. It's just the local person who decides to use child labor or to have a terribly awful environment for their workers, or all the other possible ways that human rights can be violated by small business. And the UN has sort of come around that their plan is not just limited to multinationals, although that was their original idea for their treaty. But I'm just kind of wondering given all the strategies we talked about that involve interactions with the heads of multinationals, how do you actually make progress with all the small industries that may not be part of a global supply chain, but nevertheless are where most of the abuses are happening?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a bit overwhelming to think about what you just said. I said a few minutes ago that I think the business and human rights field is where the human rights field was 40 years ago. We're just beginning to figure out even what we're talking about and what's working. And so your observation is absolutely correct. The majority of things that are going wrong in this broad field are happening in places that we can't see, by companies that we will never ever be able to get at. At the same time, I think you have to start with the place where you have leverage, and you have to start with the companies that have the resources to actually do the right thing. It's much easier dealing, however complicated, with Coke or with Nike or with Microsoft or even Meta, and I don't know if I would go as far as saying Exxon, but it's easier to deal with companies that actually have so much money that they can begin to set some standards and metrics. So that's where I am. It doesn't mean it solves the problem, but I want the biggest companies globally to accept that this is a business responsibility, a priority, set some guidelines for what this looks like, and hopefully there'll be an effect on others over time. That, what you just described, is a multi-century effort, and I'm just trying to do what I can in the time that I'm here. That's fair.
Other questions? Anybody? Oh yeah, back there. Yeah, unfortunately, I'll ask you to come up here. There are some mics here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mike. I'm an SJD student at the law school, working in this area. And I wanted to know, in my conversations with my research person so far, the dominant theme has always been, in answering the question of what will make companies do the right thing, is always the bottom line. I suppose that's obvious, but that's the dominant answer that I get. But one example that we looked at was the Facebook or Meta Oversight Board and the standards that they apply, international human rights law. And I thought that there was something else that animates the creation of that board, but my friend at the Oversight Board, who I talked to, still talked about because it affects the bottom line. It gives some legitimacy to the content moderation that Meta does. So my question is whether you have a sense of, in your interaction with these corporations, of something else that will push them to do the right thing other than the bottom line, like some accounting of their role in society, in the community, or whether that's just naive to think about there's any other pressure point that will make them act beyond what affects their profit.
Well, when you say the bottom line, one thing that affects the bottom line is being on the wrong side of a regulation by a government that's serious. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was created in 1977. It says you can't bribe a foreign official. By the way, a number of companies in the United States pushed for the adoption of that act. The SEC did an investigation. They interviewed people from 200 American companies, and they revealed that they had paid $300 million in bribes the previous year. The head of Gulf Oil came to the Senate, to Senator Church, and testified in a public hearing. I want you to tell us we can't bribe foreign officials. I'm tired of doing that. Honduras, the president of Honduras asked for a $2.5 million bribe from Chiquita brands. It's called Chiquita Gate. There was a big scandal. At the end of the day, that law meant that Siemens, a German company, was charged by the SEC and the Justice Department with paying bribes in dozens of countries. In 2008, they paid $800 million in fines. That's a certain kind of bottom line discussion. A serious regulation applied at the time by a serious US government. And the day after that judgment, every company in the United States, those Fortune 500 companies, was calling their lawyers, or their lawyers were calling them to say, we better have somebody figure out how we train people so that they don't bribe foreign officials. That's what we need. At the end of the day, companies need a kick in the pants. Regulation does that. And, you know, the advisory, the oversight board was, I'm going to be a little cynical here, as much public relations as anything. They're very decent people on that board, but to call that the Supreme Court, are you kidding? This is a private company that needs to regulate the way they operate, and they're not doing it. And the advisory board, which hears 80 cases a year and writes legal opinions, and has, you know, the company giving, what, $20 million to run that? Again, a company making $120 billion. I'm not convinced that's part of the solution.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Either
You
one.
have to go to the mic.
You have a choice. You can go left or right.
Hi, I'm Tara. I'm a PhD student in technology and operations in Ross, and I'm very interested in, you know, social media and AI roles in, you know, I'm very interested in knowing how we can operate better so that society can benefit. And so one of the things is that you talked about content moderation, and we know that there are reasons for increasing engagement through, you know, manipulating people a little bit, like using their confirmation biases or sycophancy in AI that has been shown to be there.
Right.
Now, the thing is that I think one way is to use regulation, but another way is to have a way for people to ask for something so that, for example, as a person who uses social media, I would let them know that if I am not in control of what I observe, I would not pay for it next month. Something like that. And we know that, for example, Gen Z, nowadays, they are very interested in, you know, taking more care of environment compared to other previous generations. So why do you think this is not a way to approach it on people asking for it, and otherwise they wouldn't pay for it, and therefore, strategically, it's better for that company to make more transparency, etc.
So one of the problems is that when it comes to social media, we're not the customer, we're the product. We're not, when you go on to Google or YouTube, what you're doing is giving data to those companies so that they can sell that data to advertisers. The advertisers are the customers. And so at the end of the day, advertisers don't have an alternative. You know, there are 3 billion people or 2.5 billion people on Facebook, on YouTube, on Instagram. TikTok, which is a less than 10-year-old company, is now 200 million US users. Advertisers know that, and they want our eyeballs on their ads. So I don't think there's any way the companies really care what you and I think. As long as we keep giving them our data so that they can sell the ads, I think they're perfectly happy with the way things are. I don't think we really have the incentive to change that. Now, again, I mentioned the middleware. The moment at which we can change what we see, then it gets more interesting. But they don't want that. And they're not going to want that until a government says you have to have that. We have to allow that.
And do you think it is the same for AI too, like similar to social media?
I think it's going to be the same on steroids, actually. OpenAI just announced that they're looking at an advertising model. There's 3 ways they're going to pay for these very expensive toys that they're building. I mean, the technology is amazing. By the way, there's a lot of great things that come from all what generative AI can do. It's going to help science and education, all sorts of positives. At the end of the day, you either have an advertising model, you have a subscription model. You can pay now to get Claude for whatever. I don't think that'll sustain the company's bottom line, or governments can pay for it. Maybe in poor countries that'll happen a bit, but at the end of the day, I think we're going to wind up with the same kinds of challenges we face with social media.
Thank you.
Okay. Getting to the end. Anybody? Last call? Questions? No? Exhausted everything? Wonderful. I just want to make a couple of comments. I think the issue you raised in response, you said it has to be in some way sector specific, right? The measurements, right? So it's apparel. Issues apparel is different than issues in, say, mining or something else, food. So I agree with you. And also businesses, apparel business doesn't really care about human rights issues in a chemical business or in some other business. So there's always a peer comparison going on. So if you look at the FLA, when the peer companies have come, in Nike, Adidas, Patagonia, they're all there. And so it creates, common set of issues, a common set of problems. How do we address some of these things? It also creates a safe space. So there are other reasons why it should become more sector specific, just to kind of, drill down a little bit more. And even from a pressure point perspective, so the other example I've typically given is this Access to Medicines Foundation in Netherlands. So Access to Medicines Foundation in Netherlands ranks global pharma companies on what they are doing to improve access to their medicines, through R&D, through investments in neglected disease, drugs and neglected disease, et cetera. But it's ranking global pharma companies. It comes up with this index every 2 years. It's a beauty ranking, and people care. Pfizer cares about how they compare with Novartis, how they compare with GSK. So that's what the CEOs will pay attention to. So I think that's another reason why this should be thought about. And Steve, to your point, I think, yes, small companies is a challenge, but I think small companies are part of larger supply chains. So there could be an influence chain there. I mean, we see that in FLA also. There are lots of small companies that come in. But the other question I thought where you were going is most of these actions are coming from multinationals, but they're US and Europe based. But now if there are big companies coming up in China, big companies coming up from India, et cetera, who is asking them, even the big ones there, who is asking them to do the right thing? Just like we are asking here, Nike or Adidas or somebody else to do the right thing. That to me is a bigger issue, is an equally big issue, right? So, because small companies, yes, as to Mike's point, there's a centuries-old kind of thing to be solved, and we are here only for a finite amount of time, but we can do where we can make a difference. But I think, which means that how do we create similar institutions, whether it's FLA or other like, and in these countries about what to do, right? So just kind of a comment I thought I'll share, okay? Well, thank you, Mike. Really appreciate it. Let's give Mike a big round.